There was no water for 50 miles in any direction you cared to point. Not a creek, not a stock tank, not a green thing that hadn't given up. Just cracked ground that curled at the edges like old paper, and a sky that had forgotten how to be anything but blue. And in the middle of all that dying, a woman in a black dress counted out good money, real coin, the kind we hadn't seen in a year, to buy a steamship. A steamship, sitting dead in a dry wash, 50 miles from the nearest living drop of water, with a hull full of sand and a whistle that hadn't blown in a decade. The whole town came out to watch her do it. Some laughed. Some just shook their heads and went home to figure how they'd feed their stock another week. I didn't laugh. I don't rightly know why. Maybe because I'd been counting rainless days on a fence post so long the notches ran clear around the wood. Maybe because there was something in the set of her jaw I recognized from my own shaving mirror. The look of somebody who's already lost the thing that mattered and is just deciding what to do with the leftover life. What happened after that I've told maybe 3 times in my life, and each time somebody's called me a liar to my face. That's fine. I know what I saw. I saw the impossible come up that wash with a sound like the whole world clearing its throat. And I saw a dead ship remember it was born to float. But I'm getting ahead. Let me start where it started, with a widow, a wreck, and a town that thought it had already seen the last surprise this country had left to give. The day she bought the Lorna, I was down to my last 11 head, and 9 of those were walking bones. I'd driven them in from the Perdido Flats to sell whatever the sale barn would give, which by then was next to charity. That's the only reason I was in town, not the auction of the wreck, which nobody with sense would have crossed the street for. I was leaning on the rail outside Furlong's Mercantile, watching a fly try to drink from the corner of my eye and losing my patience with it, when the crowd started drifting toward the dry wash below the church. Word had gone round that old man Baird was finally selling the boat. Now you have to understand about the boat. The Lorna had come up the Perdido back when the Perdido was still a river, a shallow, muddy, ill-tempered river, but a river all the same. This was before my time, before the territory was much of anything. She was a stern wheeler, not big as the ones they ran on the real rivers back east, but big enough that hauling her up a stream that shallow must have been a special kind of madness. The story went that a speculator meant to run freight and passengers between the mining camps, and for about 2 years he did, and then the Perdido did what desert rivers do. It didn't dry up all at once. It just came less and less, until one spring it didn't come at all, and the Lorna sat down in the mud like a tired old woman lowering herself into a chair, and there she stayed. That was 30 years back, give or take. The speculator died broke. The boat passed hands the way a bad debt does, each new owner meaning to salvage her and each one finding it cheaper to just let her sit. Baird held the paper on her last. She'd gone gray as driftwood, her paddle wheel frozen, her cabins full of pack rat nests and blown sand, her big twin stacks leaning like a drunk's fingers. Kids played in her. Once a fellow tried to live in her and lasted a winter. Mostly she was just there, the way the mountains were there. A fact of the landscape nobody thought to question anymore. And now this woman in black was going to buy her. I found a place at the edge of the crowd, next to a rail I could lean on, and I got my first good look at Cassandra Voss. She wasn't young and she wasn't old. Somewhere in that country between, where a face has decided what it's going to be and settled into it. She wore mourning black and heat that had the rest of us stripped to shirt sleeves and still dying, and she didn't sweat. Or if she did, she didn't let it show, which around here amounts to the same thing as a miracle. She had a leather satchel held against her middle with both arms, the way you'd hold a child, and when Baird named a price of a price meant to save face for having to sell a thing nobody wanted. She opened that satchel and counted the money out into his hand, coin by coin, without a word of haggling. That was the part that shut the crowd up, not the buying, the paying. She paid full, and she paid in coin, and where a body found real coin in that year of the Lord I could not have told you. "Ma'am," Baird said, and you could see him wanting to talk her out of it even as his fingers closed on the money. "You understand there's I mean to say, this here's not there's no water, ma'am." "I'm aware," she said. "She won't ever float again. The river's gone. It's been gone longer than you've likely been out here." "I know where the river went," Cassandra Voss said. "I know better than most." And that was all. She signed his paper on the tailgate of a wagon, folded her copy small and put it away in the satchel where the money had been, and walked down into the wash toward her ship like a woman going home. I want to tell you I knew right then. I didn't. Right then I thought what everybody thought, which was, grief has cracked her, poor thing, and somebody ought to send for whatever family she's got. I turned to go back to my ruined cattle and my ruined afternoon. That's when I saw Nashto up on the rise, watching her too. Nashto and I went back a ways, in the careful manner that men like us went back in that country, which is to say we'd never been enemies and had a couple times been something close to the opposite, and neither of us made much of it out loud. He traded horses mostly, and read whether the way a preacher reads scripture, with a confidence I'd learned the hard way not to bet against. His people had been all through the Perdido country before there was a Perdido country to speak of, before the surveyors and the soldiers and the rest of us. There weren't many of them left near the settlements by then. The ones that stayed the way Nashto stayed, quiet, watchful at the edge of the rise, not down in the crowd. He was watching Cassandra Voss walk into the wash, and his face did a thing I didn't have a word for. Not amusement, not pity exactly, something more like recognition. I climbed up beside him. My knee told me about it the whole way. "You know her?" I asked. No, he didn't take his eyes off the woman. "But I know that walk." "What walk is that?" He was quiet long enough I thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, the walk of a person going to argue with the dead. I looked back down at her. She'd reached the Lorna, and she'd put one hand flat against the gray flank of the hull, the way you'd greet an animal you didn't want to spook. Just stood there with her hand on the boat and her head bowed a little, and the whole dead ship above her throwing a long shadow across the sand. 50 miles to water, I said, mostly to myself. What in God's name does she think she's going to do with a steamboat? Nashto made a sound that in another man might have been a laugh. 50 miles to water, he said, if you count only the water you can see. I turned to ask him what he meant by that. He was already walking down the far side of the rise toward his horses, the way he did, leaving the interesting half of a sentence hanging in the air for you to chew on. It was a habit of his I'd have found more irritating if he hadn't been right so consistently. I didn't chew on it long. I had cattle to fail at selling. I didn't mean to get pulled into it. I want that on the record, whatever the record's worth. But the ranch was going under, and a man whose ranch is going under finds himself with a terrible amount of time on his hands, because there's nothing left to do that will do any good, and doing nothing is a torment. My wife Della had passed 2 winters before a fever, sudden, the kind that comes and goes like weather, and I'd learned in the empty time after her that I could not simply sit in a quiet house. So I rode. I rode fence lines that didn't need riding and check tanks that I already knew were dry, and I found 3 days after the sale that I'd ridden the long way round to the Perdido Wash without exactly deciding to. She was there, of course she was there. She'd rigged a canvas lean-to against the shady side of the hull and set up a kind of camp, neat, spare, a woman's camp, everything in its place. A little cook fire, a folding chair, and she'd been at work. There were tools laid out on a canvas, and she'd cleared one of the cabins of 30 years of pack rat and sand, and she was up on the boiler deck when I rode up, doing something to the machinery I couldn't make out from below. "You'll want to water that horse before you talk to me," she called down, not turning around. "There's a barrel by the fire. It came dear, so let him drink and no more." I got down. I watered my horse from her dear barrel because it would have been an insult not to, and because he needed it. Then I stood there feeling foolish, a grown man with no reason to be somewhere, and I said the only true thing I had. "Ma'am, half the county thinks you've lost your mind." "Only half," she said. "I'm doing better than I thought." And she came down the ladder, wiping her hands on a rag, and looked at me straight. Up close her eyes were a pale, tired gray, and there was grease on her forearms and a smudge on her jaw, and she looked more alive than she had at the sale, which surprised me. Grief hadn't cracked her. Grief had given her a job. "My name's Wade Corliss," I said. I ran cattle out on the Perdido Flats." "Cassandra Voss," she didn't offer her hand. Her hands were black with old grease. "You said ran." "I'm down to 11 head. 9 of 'em I'll be lucky to keep breathing to autumn." I don't know why I told her that. I hadn't said it that plain to anyone. Maybe because she'd said it about herself first, in a way, the black dress, the 50 miles, the impossible boat. Maybe like calls to like when both of them are drowning. She looked at me a moment. Then she said, "Come up. I'll show you what a crazy woman does with a steamboat." Here is what her husband had believed, and what she believed, and what I did not believe, that afternoon on the deck of the Lorna. His name had been Abel Voss, and he'd been a riverboat engineer, a real one back east on real water, before the two of them had come west chasing a contract that fell through the way Western contracts did. He'd worked the Perdido in its last living years on the Lorna herself, as it happened. That was how he knew her. And Abel Voss had gotten it into his head in the years after that the Perdido wasn't dead. He said it was sleeping, Cassandra told me. She'd led me to the pilot house where she'd cleared a table and spread out papers, maps, Abel's maps, covered in a small, precise hand and lines of figures I couldn't follow. He'd talked to the old-timers. He'd talked to, she paused, to the Apache who'd trade with him. And he put it together with what he knew about rivers, which was a great deal. This country doesn't get rain, but when it does get rain. It comes all at once, I said, because I knew that much. Everybody who'd lost a fence to a summer wash knew that much. Once a decade, sometimes less often, the mountains catch a storm they can't hold. She traced a line on the map up into the high country where the Perdido started. And it comes down all these little dry cuts at once, and they meet, and the wash, this wash, the one your ship is sitting in, carries more water in 3 days than it sees in the other 10 years combined. He calculated it. He calculated how much. She looked up at me. Enough to float her, Mr. Corliss. Enough once to float this ship right off the sand. I looked out the pilot house window at 50 miles of cracked and dying nothing. That's a hard thing to sit and wait for, I said, as gentle as I could. A storm that comes once in 10 years. A man could wait his whole life and not see it. He did, she said. Wait his whole life. He died last spring, Mr. Corliss, still figuring the numbers, still certain. Everyone he ever told thought he was a fool. She folded the map, careful at the creases, the same careful way she'd folded Baird's paper. I didn't buy this ship to float it. I want to be clear about that, since you rode all this way to find out if I'm mad. I bought it because it's the last thing his hands worked on that still standing, and because... She stopped. Her jaw did the thing I'd seen at the sale, the deciding thing. And because I'm going to prove him right if it kills me, she said. Not the floating. That's foolishness. I know it's foolishness. But the water. He was right about the water. It's coming. And when it comes, this whole country is going to lose everything it hasn't already, because nobody's ready to catch a thing they don't believe in. She put her hand flat on the pilot house wall, the same way she'd greeted the hull at the sale. So I'm going to be ready. I'm going to turn my dead husband's ship into the biggest cistern this territory has ever seen. And when the flood comes and goes, and everyone else is standing in mud watching their salvation run back into the sand, I am going to have water. His water. Enough to matter. I didn't say anything for a while. Below us, my horse blew and shifted at the end of his rein. I thought she was cracked. I want to be honest about that because of what came after. Standing in that pilot house with the heat coming up off 50 miles of dead ground, listening to a widow talk about a 10-year flood, I thought, this is grief wearing the clothes of a plan. I'd worn those same clothes myself. I knew the fit of them. But I also thought about my 9 walking bone cattle, and the fence post with the notches running all the way around. And I thought, what else exactly did I have to do? How were you fixing to seal a 30-year-old hull by yourself? I heard myself ask. Something changed in her face, not a smile. She wasn't a woman who spent smiles cheap, but something eased, some load she'd been carrying alone shifted a half-inch onto a second back. Slowly, she said, and badly, why? Because I've caulked a stock tank or 2 in my time, I said. And because it appears I'm out of better ideas than a crazy woman's boat. That was the first day. I'd like to say I signed on out of belief, but that would be a lie, and Della always said I was a poor enough liar that I oughtn't waste the effort. I signed on because it gave a drowning man something to do with his hands. I rode back out the next morning with what tools I had. And the morning after that, word got round, the way word does, the Corliss fellows out there helping the mad widow with her boat, must have caught it from her, and folks laughed at the both of us now, which if I'm honest bothered me more than it bothered her. She didn't seem to hear it. She had her numbers and her dead husband's certainty and a hull to seal, and the laughing of the living meant nothing set against the argument she was having with the dead. But somebody else came out to the wash that first week too. I rode up one evening, tired and sunburnt, and there was Nashto, sitting his horse at the edge of the wash, watching Cassandra work a mallet along a seam with the patience of a woman with all the time in the world and none of it to waste. You believe her, I said to him. It wasn't quite a question. Nashto watched her a while longer. The light was going gold, and long the way it does out there, and the shadow of the Lorna lay across the sand like the shadow of a thing much larger than itself. "My grandmother's grandmother saw the wash run full," he said finally. "It is in the stories, the water that comes without rain. It takes what it wants and it gives what it wants and it does not ask." He turned his horse unhurried. "The old man, her husband, he asked us about it years back. Most of your people, when we tell them about the water, they laugh or they write it down wrong or they try to sell it." He listened. A pause. "She listens too." "You could tell her that," I said. "It might mean something to her to know somebody believes it." Nashto looked at me then, and there was that thing in his face again, the recognition edged this time with something harder. "She is not sealing that hull because she believes the water is coming, Corliss," he said. "She is sealing it because her husband is dead and her hands need somewhere to put the grief. The believing is yours to worry over. Hers is already spent." He gathered his reins. "The water will come whether she believes or you believe or anyone believes. That is the trouble with water. It was never waiting on us." And he rode off into the gold light, leaving, as always, the interesting half of it hanging in the air. I stood there in the shadow of the Lorna and watched Cassandra Voss work a mallet along a seam of a ship that would never float, sealing it drop by careful drop against a flood that might not come in either of our lifetimes. And for the first time, standing there, tired and beaten and out of better ideas, I found I wanted the impossible thing to be true. We worked that hull through the worst of the summer, and I learned the shape of Cassandra Voss the way you learn a piece of hard country, slowly, and by getting hurt on it. She rose before light. She worked past dark by the light of a lantern that cost her an oil she could ill afford. She ate like a woman refueling a machine, without pleasure and without waste, and she talked while she worked but never about herself, only about the boat, the numbers, the water, until I knew Abel Voss's calculations near as well as she did, and had started, God help me, to half believe them. The plan was madder than it sounds and saner than you'd think. We weren't trying to make the Lorna seaworthy. That ship would never take another voyage, and we both knew it. We were making her tight. We were sealing her hull and her lower cabins and her cargo holed into one great vessel that would hold water instead of ride on it. Abel had drawn it all out. When the flood came down the wash, it would rise around her, and if she was sealed, she'd fill through channels we cut and could close, through the old boiler intakes he'd marked. And when the flood ran back out to the sand, as it always did, as it always would, the Lorna would keep what she'd caught. A hull that size, sealed, would hold water enough for 100 head of cattle through the driest year the country could throw. Maybe more, maybe a town's worth. If the flood came, if Abel's numbers were right, if we finished in time. 3 ifs, each one heavy enough to sink a man's hope by itself. We didn't talk about them. We cogged. Nashto came and went. He never picked up a mallet. That wasn't the shape of the thing between him and us, and I understood it well enough not to ask, but he brought things. Twice he brought water, hauled from a seep his people knew of in the high rocks, a seep that wasn't on any of our maps, and that I had the good sense never to ask the location of. Once he brought a haunch of antelope when he could see we were living on beans and stubbornness. And he brought knowledge, which was the dearest thing he brought, and the one Cassandra prized above the meat and the water both. He told us how the water would come. "Not like your rain," he said, one evening by the fire, drawing in the sand with a stick. Cassandra sat across from him with her whole attention on his hands, the way she'd watch Abel's maps. "Your rain, you see it coming. Clouds, thunder, you have time to be afraid the right amount. This," he made a slashing line in the sand, the wash, and above it a scatter of dots, the mountains. "This comes down from a storm you never saw. The sky here is blue. You are standing in the sun. And it comes anyway, from far off, all these little cuts filling at once." His stick drew them all running together, and by the time you hear it, it is already deciding whether you live. "How much warning?" Cassandra asked, always practical, always the next number. "If you are watching the birds and the snakes and the ants a day sometimes, they know before you." His stick paused. "If you are only watching with your eyes like your people, the length of a breath. 2. You hear it come around the bend up there." He pointed north, up the wash, where it curved out of sight behind a shoulder of red rock. "And then it is here. You do not run from it if you are in the wash. You are already where it wants you." I felt the cold of that go down my back, sitting there in the summer heat, because we were in the wash. We worked in the wash every day at the bottom of it, in the belly of a ship that sat below the level of the banks, if the water came while we were sealing a seam. We'll post a watch, Cassandra said, reading my face. Upstream, someone to give the cry. You will need more than a cry, Nashto said. He smoothed the sand flat with his palm, wiping the whole map away, the mountains and the wash and the running water all gone back to blank ground. You will need to already believe it before it comes. The ones who die, he stood, unfolding himself in that unhurried way, they die in the 2 breaths they spend not believing. The water does not kill them. Their surprise kills them. He looked down at the both of us. You believe it, Voss. That is why I bring you the seep water. You I do not have to bury. Then to me dry as the ground. You, Corliss, I am not so sure of. The morally heavy part, the part I've never told straight, the part that still sits in me like a stone I swallowed, came in the middle of autumn when we were close to done and the money ran out. Cassandra had spent it all. The coin that had shut the town up at the sale and more besides. She'd been selling things, I realized slowly over the weeks. Small things at first. Then Abel's watch. Then 1 week her wedding band, which I only knew because I saw the pale stripe on her finger where it had been and had the poor grace to look, and she caught me looking, and neither of us said a word about it. She was spending her dead husband's memory a piece at a time to seal his ship, and I understood then that Nashto had been righter than he knew. This was grief with a hull, grief you could caulk. We needed pitch, real pitch and tar, and lead for the seams below the water line, more than we had, to finish the hold before winter closed the passes and the material stopped coming through. Without it, the lower hull would leak, and a cistern that leaks is just a slow grave for hope. We had one more push in us and no money to buy the makings of it. And there was a man in town, I'll not use his name, his grandchildren are decent people and it's no fault of theirs, who had the pitch. He'd bought up a freight lot cheap. He'd sell it to us, for a price. The price was the Lorna herself. He'd figured it the way that kind of man figures things. He'd watched us work all summer, watched Cassandra pour her widowhood into that hull, and he'd decided, same as Abel had, same as Nashto's stories said, that the water was coming. He believed it because we did, and he wanted the cistern for himself when it filled. So he offered pitch enough to finish on paper with a lien. If the ship filled, if Abel was right, the water, and the ship came to him. She'd have done all the work and caught all the water and owned at the end. A wet grave with another man's name on the deed. I found out because he came to me first. Figured I was the reasonable one, being a man, being broke. Figured I'd talk sense to the widow. I rode out to the wash with his offer in my pocket, and the whole ride I argued both sides of it to myself and the horse, who had opinions about neither. Because here was the thing, and it's the thing I've never made peace with. The offer would work. We'd finish. If the flood came, the ship would fill. Cassandra would have proved Abel right. The water, the great thing, the thing she was really after, even if the water itself belonged to somebody else. And I could see, plain as the dead ground, that we would not finish without it, that we'd sealed a ship that would leak, that her wedding band and Abel's watch and the whole terrible summer would come to a hull that filled and emptied and kept nothing. Prove him right and lose everything, or keep everything and prove him a fool. I sat with that offer in my pocket for 2 days before I gave it to her. 2 days. I'll carry those 2 days a while yet, the not telling, the weighing of a widow's grief against her own good like I had the right. In the end, I gave it to her because I'd have wanted the choice myself, and because Della's voice in the back of my skull told me a man who decides another person's grief for them isn't a friend. He's just a gentler kind of thief. Cassandra read the offer twice. She was up on the boiler deck. She read it and looked out over the wash, and then off north to where the wash curved behind the red rock, and the water would come from if it ever came. He believes it too, then, she said, quiet. He believes it because we do. He's not wrong to, that's what makes it. I stopped. Cruel, she finished. Yes. She folded the paper, careful at the creases. Her thumb moved over the pale stripe where the band had been. If I sign, Abel is right, and a grasping little man drinks the proof of it for the rest of his days. If I don't, the hull leaks, and Abel is a fool who married a fool, and everything I sold. Her voice didn't break. It was steadier than mine would have been. Everything I sold bought nothing. The wind came up the wash and moved her black skirts, and moved nothing else in all that dead country. Mr. Corliss, she said, would you take that horse of yours and ride to the seep, Nashto's seep, if he'll show you, and ask him one thing for me? He won't show me the seep, I said. Ask him, she said, whether his people ever sealed a thing with something other than a white man's pitch. She handed me back the grasping man's offer unsigned. Before I trade my husband's ship for tar, I'd like to know if the tar is the only thing that seals. I'll spare you the full of that ride, which was long and which I made mostly in the dark, and Nashto's face when a broke rancher rode up to a seep he'd never been shown asking after the old ways of sealing a hull. He didn't show me the seep. He met me a mile short of it, having heard me coming for an hour. You ride like a barrel falling downhill, Corliss? And he listened to the question, and then he was quiet a long time in the cold dark. Pine pitch, he said at last. From the high trees, and a thing my grandmother made from the plant that bleeds white and the ash of a certain wood and the fat. We sealed baskets with it that would carry water a day's walk and not weep a drop. He looked at me. It is slow to make. It is not enough for a whole ship. But the lower seams, the deep ones your tar was for, he nodded slow. Those it would hold, better than your tar, maybe. My grandmother's baskets outlived my grandmother. She'd have to trade the ship to get the tar, I said. The other way she keeps the ship. But it's your grandmother's medicine, Nashto, your people's. I've got no right to ask you to spend it on a white widow's boat. The cold desert stars were very bright and very far. Somewhere off in the dark, a small thing killed a smaller thing, and the smaller thing cried out once and stopped. My people made that seal to carry water through dry country, Nashto said finally. For as long as there have been my people, that is what it was for, to keep the water when the water is gone. He turned his horse back toward the seep, toward whatever it was he wasn't going to show me. It was never meant to seal a boat, but it was always meant to save the thirsty. He paused, half in the dark. Tell her I will come. Tell her it will take until the pass is close. Tell her, and here his voice did a thing I'd not heard it do, went rough at the edge. Tell her she is the first of your people to ask what we know instead of what we have. That is worth a grandmother's medicine. Now go home before you fall off that horse, and I have to bury you after all. So we didn't sign the grasping man's paper. We finished the Lorna with pine pitch off the high trees and a white bleeding plant, and the ash of a wood Nashto never named, worked into the deep seams by his hands and Cassandra's and mine, in a race against the closing passes and the coming cold. Nashto came near every day that last stretch, and it was a strange thing to see the three of us, the widow and the rancher and the Apache, sealing a dead ship against a flood the whole living world laughed at, our hands all the same color with pitch by the end of any given day. The grasping man came out once to see why I'd never brought his paper back. He stood at the top of the wash and looked down at what we were doing and understood he'd lost, and he said some words I won't repeat, and Cassandra didn't even look up from her seam. He believes it too, was all she said after he'd gone. He'll be sorriest of all of us if it comes, to have believed and reached and missed. There wasn't triumph in it, just the plain sorrow of a woman who'd learned that being right about water didn't stop you grieving everything else. We finished the last seam the day the first snow dusted the high peaks, the peaks where Abel's numbers said the water would someday be born. And then there was nothing left to do but wait. That's the part nobody warns you about, the waiting. We'd raced all summer and autumn against 3-ifs, and now the ship was sealed and tight as a grandmother's basket, and we had done everything a body could do, and the country was still dead, and the sky was still blue, and the water, Abel's water, the impossible water, the water that came once in 10 years without rain. The water was still just a dead man's number on a folded map. I notched my fence post that winter same as always. The notches ran clear around and started up a second post. We waited. The impossible came on the 9th day of the following July, out of a blue and cloudless sky, exactly as a dead man had said it would. I wasn't at the wash when it started. I want that known because it's the shame of my life, that after a whole year of believing, when the thing I'd waited for came, I was 50 miles the wrong way, over on the Perdido Flats trying to keep my last 4 cattle alive. 4. That's what a second dry year had left me. 4 head and a fence post covered in notches and a stubbornness I couldn't rightly account for. It was Nashto's warning that saved everyone. He'd been watching the birds. He'd said he would, and he did, faithful as a man can be, and 3 days before it came he sent his grandson riding to tell Cassandra. The ants are moving to the high ground. The snakes are leaving the low cuts. My grandfather says the water is deciding to come. And Cassandra sent the boy on to me, 50 miles, and I looked at that blue and pitiless sky, and I very nearly didn't believe it even then, even after everything. But I got on my horse. I left the 4 cattle to their fate, and I rode. Because I'd told Nashto I believed, and a man who won't ride for a thing he claims to believe never believed it at all. I got there on the evening of the 8th day. The sky was still blue. The wash was still bone dry. Cassandra was up on the boiler deck of the Lorna with a lantern, going over every seam one last time, and when I climbed up beside her, she didn't ask why I'd come or how the cattle fared. She just handed me a rag and said, "The forward hold." There's a weep I don't trust. And we worked through the night on a leak in a dry ship under a dry sky, waiting for water that hadn't come and might not come, and I have never in my life felt so much a fool and so much a believer at the same time. Nashto came at dawn. He didn't get down off his horse. He sat at the top of the wash where he always sat, and he looked north up toward the curve behind the red rock, and he said one word. "Now," and then I heard it. I have tried for 30 years to find the words for the sound of it, and I have never gotten close, so I'll tell you the true thing instead of the pretty one. It didn't sound like water, not at first. It sounded like the ground itself, far off, clearing a throat it had held shut for 10 years. A low, grinding roar, felt in the boots before it was heard in the ears, coming from up around the bend where the wash disappeared behind the shoulder of red rock. Birds went up off the banks all at once, a whole country's worth of birds, and I understood in my body before my mind caught up why Nashto watched the birds. "Up," Nashto said, not loud, and it was the loudest thing I ever heard. "Off the low deck, now, both of you." We scrambled. Cassandra didn't scramble. Cassandra climbed to the pilot house, the highest point of her dead husband's ship, and stood at the wheel he'd once turned, and she would not come higher and she would not come down, and I understood there was no arguing it. So I climbed up beside her, and we stood at the wheel of a ship in a dry wash and watched the impossible come around the bend. It came brown, and it came fast, and it came high, higher than the banks, higher than I'd have believed. A wall of water and mud and whole uprooted trees and the drowned country's worth of debris. And it came without a single cloud in the sky above it, born of a storm 3 days ride away in mountains we couldn't see. It filled the wash the way water fills a poured glass, all at once, edge to edge, and the roar of it drowned every other sound in the world. And I gripped the wheel of that ship, and I believed, finally and completely and far too late to be any credit to me, every word a dead man had ever written on a folded map. The water hit the Lorna. And the ship, the dead ship, the gray old driftwood ship, 30 years sat down in the sand, the ship moved. I felt it through my boots first, same as the sound, a shudder, a groan of old iron and older wood. And then the deck heaved under us, and the water was rising up her sealed flanks, brown and roaring, and Abel's channels. The intakes he'd marked, that we'd cut and could close, were doing exactly the thing his numbers said, letting the water into the sealed hold so she'd fill instead of float away, so she'd catch the flood instead of riding it off to shatter on the first bend. But she wanted to float. God, she wanted to. A year of my life I'd spent believing she never could, and now the water had her, and she strained up against her own weight and the sand's long grip. And there was one moment I'll swear to on anything you put in front of me, when the Lorna came free of the sand entirely and floated, actually floated on the flood of the Perdido come back to life, the way she was built to, the way she hadn't in 30 years. Cassandra made a sound then. I've never known what to call it. It wasn't a word. It wasn't a sob, though there was water on her face that hadn't come from the flood. It was the sound a person makes when the dead are proved right, and it doesn't bring them back, grief and triumph so tangled you can't pull one from the other, and maybe there's no reason to try. She had both hands on Abel's wheel, and her dead husband's ship was floating under her on water everyone in the world had told her would never come. And she was right. She was right. She had been right all along, and being right cost exactly as much as it was worth. Then the channels did their work, and the hold filled, and the Lorna settled, heavy now with the water she'd caught, too heavy to be carried off back down into her bed, but changed, transformed, no longer a dead ship in a dry wash, but a full one. A cistern. The biggest this territory had ever seen, brimming to her sealed decks with the flood of a 10-year storm, while all around her the water she couldn't hold ran on down the wash and out to the flats, and in 3 days back into the sand and the sky gone, the way it always went, the way it always would. Everyone else in that country stood in mud and watched their salvation run away. Cassandra Voss had caught hers. I'll tell the rest quick, the way you tell the part after the part that mattered. The water in the Lorna got that country through the dry years that followed, and there were dry years, hard ones. Not everyone, not enough. Water's never enough. There's always more thirst than there is water, and that's a truth I've made my peace with about as well as I've made peace with anything. but it kept stock alive that would have died. It kept some families on land they'd have had to walk off of. My 4 cattle drank from it, and became 40 in time, though I was an old man by the time they did, and it was other hands than mine that mostly built them back. The grasping man never got his cistern. He got to be sorriest of all of us, exactly as Cassandra said, to have believed and reached and missed by the width of an unsigned paper. I won't pretend I was sorry for him. I'm not that good a man. Nashto's grandmother's seal held. Every deep seam we'd worked with pine pitch and the white bleeding plant, and the ash of the wood he never named, held better than any tar, held the way her baskets had outlived her. The one seam we'd feared, the weep in the forward hold that Cassandra didn't trust, that we'd worked on all through that last dry night, that one held too. It was Nashto's people's medicine, made to save the thirsty, that kept the water in a dead man's ship. I've never heard that told right in all the versions of this story that get told. They always leave him out or make him small, and I've quit correcting people who weren't going to listen anyhow. But you've heard it now, told straight. The seal that saved that country was a grandmother's, and she was Apache, and her grandson gave her medicine to a white widow because it was always meant to save the thirsty, and it did not care whose thirst. Cassandra stayed. She lived out her years in the pilot house of the Lorna, keeper of the water, and folks who'd laughed at the mad widow came to speak of her low and grateful, the way you speak of weather that spared you. She never took the wedding band's place with another. She'd spent the band on the seal, and I think she reckoned the trade a fair one, a ring for the proof of a marriage worth more than any ring. Abel Voss had been right, and everyone knew it, and it was carved on no stone anywhere, but it was true in the mouth of every rancher who watered stock at the widow's boat, and maybe that's a better marker than granite. I sat with her the last evening of her life, years on, an old woman in a pilot house and an older man with a fence post at home covered in the notches of every rainless day, which by then I kept more from habit than despair. The Lorna was low that year. Another dry stretch. We'd both seen enough of them by then to know the water in her would come again, someday out of a blue sky without warning, when the mountains caught a storm they couldn't hold. You were right, I told her. About all of it, the water, Abel, I never told you plain. I thought you were mad that first day, and I helped you anyhow, and you were right. She looked out the pilot house window at the dark wash, dry now, waiting. He was right, she said. I only refused to let him be wrong alone. Her hand moved on the wheel, the old habit. That's not the same as believing Wade. It took me longer than you to believe. I believed the morning it came around the bend, same as you, not 1 day sooner. A pause. Her voice had gone thin with age, but the jaw still did its deciding thing even then. That's the part I'd want them to know if anyone tells it, that I didn't believe either. That you can do the whole work of a faith you don't have, and the water comes anyway. It was never waiting on us to believe it. Which was Nashto's line, or near enough, said to me on a gold evening a lifetime before. And I told her so, and she smiled. She spent one at the end on that, and said that made sense, that of course it was his, that all the true things in this story had come from him and been carved on no stone at all. The wash is dry as I write this. It's been dry a long while now. But the ship is still there, sealed tight with a grandmother's medicine, waiting the way she was taught to wait, the way we all learned to wait, for the water that comes without rain, out of a blue and cloudless sky, on a day that no one is.